Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. Today we're talking about forensic science, the art of solving crimes with science. The pairing of art and science here is intentional, and their connection will become clearer as we progress. We will begin by examining forensic science and its inherent risks in general terms. Following this, we will explore a series of specific cases, near misses, and wrongful convictions that highlight the intricate interplay between science, human factors, and the legal system. Finally, we will conclude with an overview of the legal framework, focusing on the Forensic Science Regulator Act 2021 and its Code of Conduct. So grab your magnifying glass, because we are about to analyze evidence, not just leave fingerprints on your interests. Forensic science, simply put, involves using scientific methods and principles to investigate criminal cases. It seeks to answer the same fundamental questions: who did what to whom, where and when, and why, though the motive is not always essential. The distinction lies in solving these questions by assembling the puzzle with the aid of science. Forensic science is, or should be, a highly exact discipline based on rigorous scientific methods such as DNA analysis, fingerprinting, and toxicology, which are grounded in reproducible laboratory practices that, when properly applied, can provide highly accurate and reliable results. The reliability of forensic science lies in its repeatability, meaning that when the test is repeated, it consistently produces the same result with minimal or no variation each time. For example, DNA profiling has a statistical probability of misidentification so low that it is often considered the gold standard in criminal investigations. However, forensic science does not function in a vacuum. Its interpretation and use are intertwined with a complex human and legal context. These interactions can lead to errors, biases, and subjective judgments, even in a field considered objective and exact. It is at this point that science can transition into art. For example, while full DNA matches can provide seemingly straightforward conclusions, challenges arise in cases involving partial matches or mixed DNA profile. These scenarios rely on probabilistic analysis and subjective interpretations. The interpretations of probabilities can differ significantly, leading to varying conclusions based on the same data. Complexities and limitations in forensic science are not always effectively communicated to jurors or judges who might lack the scientific background to grasp nuances. This creates a risk of overestimating the conclusiveness of evidence, particularly when presented with technical jargon or incomplete explanations. This phenomenon, known as the CSI effect, can distort decision-making. The broader legal and human context further complicates forensic application. Subjectivity is further exacerbated by factors such as confirmation bias, where forensic experts might unconsciously or purposefully align their findings with the narrative of the party that engaged them, whether prosecution or defense. In addition, factors such as the pressure to secure convictions, time constraints, and resource limitations may influence the accuracy of forensic interpretations. Not to mention certain branches of forensic science, such as bite mark analysis, for example, which are inherently interpretative from the outset. However, even highly reliable and indisputable evidence appropriately collected and developed must be treated as one part of a broader investigative toolkit rather than a definitive proof of guilt. For example, while DNA is highly reliable, phenomena such as secondary transfer, also known as indirect deposition of DNA, must be kept in mind when presented in the context of criminal proceedings. Secondary transfer occurs when genetic material is transferred from one individual to an object or another individual without direct contact. For example, a person's DNA might transfer to a second individual through shared surfaces, or it could transfer to an item that the first individual never directly handled. This phenomenon highlights a critical limitation in interpreting DNA evidence. The presence of DNA at a crime scene does not necessarily establish direct contact or involvement in a crime. There are several mechanisms of secondary transfer. For example, some individuals known as high shedders naturally deposit more skin cells or DNA onto surfaces, increasing the likelihood of indirect transfer. There is also the risk of DNA being passed through intermediates, such as objects or people who serve as conduits between the original source and the final deposition site. The case of David Butler, for example, shows how secondary transfer can lead to incorrect conclusion when taken out of context. In 2011, David Butler, a taxi driver from Liverpool, was accused of the murder of Anne-Marie Foy, who was sadly murdered in 2005. A partial profile of his DNA was found under the victim's fingernail, which led to his arrest and prosecution. However, Butler consistently denied any involvement, claiming he had never met Miss Foy. Key to Butler's defense was the argument that his DNA could have been transferred indirectly. He suffered from a severe skin condition which made him a high shedder. His defense suggested that his DNA might have been transferred to the victim via a third party, possibly a passenger in his taxi who later encountered Miss Foy. The jury correctly and understandably found a reasonable doubt due to the lack of corroborative evidence linking Butler to the crime scene, and he was acquitted, but not before having spent 8 months in custody during his remand awaiting trial. Another example of exact forensic science taken out of context is illustrated by the case of Joseph Otoo. He was arrested after a gang of men carried out a robbery of a car hire depot on Chatham Hill in Manchester in 1995, and he was convicted in February 1997 of armed robbery and received a sentence of 7 years detention in a youth offenders institution, as he was only 17 years of age at the time. His conviction was based on a match between indentation in his training shoes and a footprint made in a flower bed by the culprit in the course of their getaway. The science was correct. That print was indeed left by Otoo's shoe. However, at trial, Otoo claimed that he had been forced to exchange footwear with someone else. Unsurprisingly, his account was dismissed and he was convicted despite presenting an alibi. It is perplexing why a defense case statement is required if it is ultimately disregarded. Following an application by the CCRC in 1998, DNA testing showed that the bodily fluid impregnating the insole of Otoo's trainers matched the person that Mr. Otoo had named as having forced him to swap footwear. His conviction was eventually overturned in 2000. These cases clearly highlight the importance of examining the complete context and considering both sides of the story. A balanced approach could prevent unnecessary distress and focus on identifying the true perpetrator. But forensic science, while revolutionary in solving crimes, carries the potential not only to wrongly convict innocent individuals, but also to fabricate the illusion of a crime where none actually occurred. Take, for example, the case of Amanda Jenkinson, an ITU nurse accused and convicted in 1996 of causing grievous bodily harm with intent to a patient. She was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. The UKCC, predecessor of the Nursing and Midwifery Council, struck off Miss Jenkinson shortly after her conviction at a hearing in which she was neither present nor represented as she was in custody. The case rested primarily on expert evidence. Dr. Schroeder had devised a mathematical formula to show that the ventilator of the patient had been tampered with whilst Miss Jenkinson was on duty. Her conviction was finally overturned in 2005 following a CCRC application when Dr. Alan Aitkenhead, a consultant anaesthetist, gave evidence which showed that the patient started deteriorating 5 hours after Miss Jenkinson went off duty. The case of Suzanne Woldzworth demonstrates another instance where a crime was manufactured where there wasn't one. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2005 after being convicted of murdering baby Kyle Fisher, a 2-year-old toddler who died in her care in 2004. Her conviction rested on expert evidence which suggested that she had repeatedly banged Kylie's head against a wooden banister with as much force as a 60-mile-per-hour crash after losing her temper. The evidence, however, was substantially flawed, as no visible blood, hair or skin was found on the banister and no DNA analysis was conducted to substantiate the evidence. She appealed against her conviction, and that conviction was eventually overturned in 2008. A retrial was ordered in which the jury was told the original expert in her case failed to diagnose that Kyle had a highly unusual brain with abnormalities that predisposed him to epilepsy. Professor Renzo Guerini, a pediatric neurologist, told the court there was a reasonable possibility the toddler suffered a prolonged epileptic seizure. He also said Woldzworth's description of Kyle's symptoms when she called 999 saying that he was floppy, hitting himself, and drifting in and out of consciousness matched such a fit. She was found not guilty at her retrial. Miss Woldzworth did not receive compensation for her wrongful conviction, despite having spent 3 years in prison. These cases demonstrate the critical need for forensic methodologies to be rigorously scrutinized and for investigators to contextualize forensic science within a broader investigative framework. By doing so, the criminal justice system can avoid scenarios where science manufactures crimes instead of uncovering the truth. Then there are instances where forensic science is initially presented as reliable, but later becomes widely discredited, commonly referred to as junk science. But before we look into this issue in more detail, here is my usual reminder. If you enjoy our videos and want to help us grow our audience, please hit the subscribe and like buttons below. Your support enables us to keep providing valuable insights into critical issues within the criminal justice system. It also gives you the chance to join our community and our discussions and shape the content of this channel. Our ultimate mission is to humanize the criminal justice system, and we can't do that without you. Thank you. Let's return to our imaginary forensic laboratory to examine the issue of junk science. Junk science refers to practices that portray theories as scientific facts, while either oversimplifying them or omitting actual error rates and relying primarily or entirely on subjective interpretation. Let's take as an example bite mark analysis. Historically presented with high confidence, bite mark analysis has been largely discredited due to a lack of scientific rigor and a high error rate. In 2015, in the course of an experiment conducted with certified dentists, Dr. Freeman, former president of the American Board of Forensic Odontology, asked the dentists to analyze bite marks. They first were asked to decide whether they were indeed in the presence of bite marks. In all but a few cases, participants could not agree on whether or not they were looking at bite marks. This was already concerning. Not only that, assuming dentists can answer the first question and agree with a certain degree of certainty that they are indeed looking at a bite mark, the problem is that human dentition, the way in which our teeth are arranged, has not been proven to be unique to each individual. But more fundamentally, the problem with using bodies to identify perpetrators of crime is that the skin is a terrible recording medium for a bite mark. Dr. Freeman said that skin is elastic, and this elasticity varies depending on how much fat a person has in their body or how old they are. Skin also holds tension and releases it in different ways as you move, which would affect the impression teeth might leave on a person. This means that if the same person bit two different people, the impressions or bruises they would leave wouldn't necessarily match. And the way that these factors impact bite marks have never been studied among living people for obvious reasons. In the UK, bite marks evidence can still be admitted to positively identify the guilty party in a crime, though they are subject to the usual test of admissibility and reliability. As you recall, in our video dedicated to Lucy Lebby's first application for leave to appeal, we discussed evidence admissibility and reliability. We learned how the admissibility test determines whether evidence can be legally and properly introduced in court. To be admissible and therefore introduced in court, evidence must be relevant, i.e. prove or disprove a fact relevant in the trial. It must be obtained lawfully, and it must not be overly prejudicial, misleading, or likely to cause unfair harm. Conversely, the reliability test evaluates whether the evidence is credible and trustworthy, a determination left to the jury. This means that the evidence is presented regardless, allowing the jury to assign its weight. However, by the time the jury considers it, any prejudice arising from its presentation may have already influenced their perceptions. Given what we now know and understand about bite marks, should they be admissible as evidence at all? This issue may hopefully gain renewed attention in a case recently referred to the Court of Appeal by the CCRC. On the 13th of November 2024, the CCRC announced that it referred the case of Peter Sullivan to the Court of Appeal following a second application. Peter Sullivan was convicted in 1987 for the brutal murder of Diane Sindel, a 21-year-old florist in Bebington, Merseyside, in 1986. Sullivan was accused of assaulting Miss Sindel with a crowbar and inflicting bite marks on her body, which became a pivotal piece of evidence in the trial and earned him the chilling nickname, the Wolfman. Sullivan, who initially confessed to the murder but later recanted, has made multiple attempts to overturn his conviction. According to the CCRC news release, he submitted an application in 2008. However, the FSS at the time advised the CCRC that further testing was highly unlikely to yield a DNA profile, leading to the rejection of his application. Sound familiar? A similar approach was taken in the case of Mr. Malkinson, if you may recall. In 2019, Sullivan applied directly to the Court of Appeal for permission to appeal, but his application was rejected in 2021. His application focused on the reliability of the bite mark evidence. However, according to the CCRC news release, the Court of Appeal ruled that this evidence was not central to the prosecution's case at trial. Sullivan then applied to the CCRC again, which this time decided to review the possibility of DNA testing. The testing revealed a DNA profile that did not match Sullivan. These new findings prompted the CCRC to refer the case back to the Court of Appeal. Although it may be premature to draw conclusions, this case, in our view, exhibits many characteristics indicative of a wrongful conviction. Sullivan was not considered a suspect until several weeks after the crime, following Crime Watch reconstructions aired nationally, which may have influenced the public and investigative perceptions. Media reports at the time portrayed Sullivan as a quiet loner, a description that may have fueled bias against him. It was also noted that he had spent the day in which the crime occurred drinking heavily after losing a darts match. This raises doubts about the reliability of his initial confession, which was likely influenced by fragmented and impaired memories of his actions and whereabouts on the day of the crime. Additionally, the CCRC has flagged potential violations of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, including police conducting interviews without ensuring Sullivan had access to an appropriate adult. This suggests possible vulnerability during the interrogation process. It was also revealed that although he had previous convictions for minor offences, there was no record of any violent behaviour. The upcoming appeal hopefully will shed some light on these issues, especially concerning the reliability of bite mark evidence. These cases of particular interest to those who examine systemic flaws in the criminal justice system, as it raises critical questions about investigative practices, evidentiary reliability, and procedural safeguards. If Peter Sullivan's conviction is ultimately found to be wrongful, it would represent a profound miscarriage of justice, given that he has already endured over 35 years of imprisonment. Such a revelation would highlight the devastating consequences of errors within the criminal justice system. A wrongful conviction of this magnitude not only robs an individual of their freedom and dignity, but also allows the true perpetrator to evade accountability, potentially putting others at risk. This case will join a long and distressing list of historical injustices, highlighting systemic vulnerabilities such as a reliance on flawed evidence, procedural lapses, and the treatment of vulnerable individuals during police interrogations. The implications are far-reaching, serving as a stark reminder of the fallibility of the justice system and the human cost of its mistakes. Addressing such injustices requires ongoing reforms, including the adoption of more rigorous standards for forensic evidence and commitment to reviewing past cases with modern forensic techniques. Ultimately, if Sullivan's appeal succeeds, it would not only be a deeply sobering moment for the legal community, but also a call to action to strengthen safeguards against wrongful convictions. It would compel us to reflect on how the justice system can balance its pursuit to accountability with the imperative of fairness, ensuring that no innocent individual suffers such a devastating fate. But let's return to forensic science and our initial focus. How can we ensure the safe use of forensic science? And how have its inherent risks been addressed within the legal framework? Well, until 2002, the Forensic Science Service, the FSS, a government agency, was the primary provider of forensic science services in England and Wales, serving the police and other entities such as the Crown Prosecution Service and Revenue and Customs. In 2002, efforts to foster a more competitive forensic science market led to a decline in services to the police, requiring the FSS to compete with private providers. By 2005, the FSS transitioned from being a government agency to be a government-owned company, which resulted in increased service costs that strained police budgets. In response, the police began conducting more forensic investigations in-house. This shift drew criticism. including from the Science and Technology Select Committee, as some police forensic units lacked the quality accreditation required of private providers who were conducting forensic work for law enforcement. To address these concerns, the Forensic Science Regulator, the FSR, was established in 2007 to advise the government and the criminal justice system on quality standards in forensic science. However, the FSR did not have statutory enforcement powers. Eventually, the FSS faced an unsustainable financial situation, prompting the government to disband it. After the FSS closure in 2012, forensic science services increasingly shifted to private and often unregulated providers. These led to noticeable fragmentation within the system, sparking significant debate about the future of forensic science in England and Wales. While practitioners and academics agreed on the critical role forensic science plays in the UK criminal justice system, facilitating the linking of evidence to suspects, establishing timelines, and reconstructing events, they highlighted that the system's fragmentation has exacerbated ongoing challenges and controversies, particularly regarding the standardization of practices. Over the past decade, key issues in forensic science have centered on fragmented protocols for evidence collection, analysis, presentation, and retention. Inconsistencies in the standards of expertise and training, underfunding, the rapid pace of technological advancements, and the ethical use of emerging technologies such as AI. The Forensic Science Regulator Act 2021, which received royal assent on the 29th of April 2021, was introduced to address the pressing issues surrounding forensic science. Let's examine this legislation in detail. The Act defines forensic science activity to which it applies as activity relating to the application of scientific methods for the detection or investigation of crime in England and Wales, and for preparation, analysis, or presentation of evidence in criminal proceedings in England and Wales. The Act's aim is to ensure that all forensic providers meet rigorous quality standards and to put a stop to unregulated practices in the field. The Act made provision for the FSR to be a statutory body with statutory powers. The Act also requires the FSR to publish and keep under review a code of practice about forensic science activities. The Forensic Science Regulator Code of Practice, which came into force on the 2nd of October 2023, highlights in its general introduction that forensic science is a critical and important part of criminal investigations and the administration of justice, not only to identify offenders and provide expert evidence to the courts, but also as one of the strongest safeguards against false allegation and wrongful conviction. The model for regulation of forensic science in England and Wales is based on each forensic unit implementing and operating effective quality management that meets the requirements of this code. And the code continues, the key elements of quality management include A. Validation of methods. B. Defining, demonstrating and testing the initial and ongoing competence of personnel. C. Having documented and controlled procedures and an internal audit process to ensure they are effective and being followed. D. Commitment from senior leadership, including making available sufficient resources. And E. Enabling continual improvement. Amongst other powers, the regulator can investigate and take enforcement action in relation to forensic science activities carried on in a manner that risks prejudicing the course of legal proceedings. It is important to note, however, that while there is a duty upon the providers to disclose their non-compliance with the Act, no civil or criminal responsibility arises from such non-compliance, nor does it automatically render evidence inadmissible. In other words, failing to adhere to the code does not bar evidence from being presented in courts. However, non-compliance can be considered by the court when determining the admissibility and reliability of the evidence under Section 19 of the Criminal Procedure Rules 2020 and Part 7 of the Criminal Practice Directions 2023, as we discussed earlier. These frameworks, however, depends heavily on a robust and proactive defense to challenge flawed forensic evidence. Unfortunately, challenges such as legal aid crisis and the reluctance of experts to assist defense teams in sensitive or high-profile cases often leave the defense with insufficient resources and expertise to effectively contest forensic evidence. As a result, the responsibility often falls on judicial gatekeeping. However, inconsistency in the judiciary's standard for admitting unreliable methods or experts have allowed questionable techniques to enter courtrooms, raising significant concerns. The ongoing debate surrounding the medical and statistical evidence presented at Lucy Letby's trial, largely discredited by leading experts, underscores these concerns and contributes to our reluctance in concluding that the current framework on its own offers a sufficient safeguard against the inherent risk of forensic science. While the existing legal and regulatory measures are vital, they fall short of fully addressing the complexity and challenges posed by the evolving landscape of forensic science. Forensic science requires continuous reassessment to adapt to rapid technological advancements, emerging ethical considerations, and the changing needs of society. Transparency remains a cornerstone of its effective application. Clear and open communication about both the strengths and the limitations of forensic methodologies is essential to fostering public trust, ensuring fairness in judicial processes, and preserving the credibility of the criminal justice system. Without these measures, the risk of misuse, misinterpretation, or over-reliance on forensic evidence may persist. And what are your thoughts? Do you believe the current framework provides a strong safeguard against the risk of science transitioning into art? I look forward to your thoughts in the comments below. That wraps up our session for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and join the conversation by becoming part of our networking hub at spokeninjustice.net. Join us again as we sit and rise in this unique trial.